Victoria Hale had not slept in 4 days. Not the kind of sleeplessness that comes from caffeine or ambition, or the ordinary pressures of running a billion-dollar company. This was something darker, something that pressed against the back of her eyes and made the fluorescent lights of Hale Financial's executive floor feel like interrogation lamps. She was 34 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's 60-year history. And on the morning of October the 14th, she stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office and watched the city wake up below her, as though she were watching it from the other side of glass she could not break. The skyline was beautiful. The sky was the pale gold of early autumn. None of it reached her. The media had been calling her a visionary for 3 years. Profiles in business journals described her as relentlessly composed, architecturally brilliant, a force of nature with a spreadsheet. Her photograph appeared on the covers of magazines, stacked in airport newsstands across the country, always the same image, really, always the straight spine and the precise blazer, and the expression that communicated absolute certainty. What those profiles never captured, because she had never allowed anyone close enough to see it, was the weight she carried behind that expression, the weight of a company built by her father, handed to her in grief, and now being quietly dismantled by people who smiled at her across conference tables and called her by her first name. Richard Kane had been her father's vice president for 11 years. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his authority the way other men wore cologne, pervasive, invisible, assumed. When Thomas Hale had died 8 months ago from a sudden cardiac event, Richard had been among the first to embrace Victoria at the memorial. And his eyes had been wet. And she had believed him. She had believed him for a long time after that. It was only in the last 6 weeks, when she began noticing inconsistencies in the quarterly filings, that she understood what those wet eyes had really been. Relief, carefully disguised as grief. Richard Kane had been waiting for her father to die. The consortium that had begun applying pressure to the board in September was registered in the Cayman Islands, and its listed directors were names that did not appear in any professional database she could locate. They held, between them and several affiliated entities, just over 31% of Hale Financial's outstanding shares, enough, combined with the board members they had apparently already converted, to force a vote on what the formal documentation described as a strategic restructuring agreement. Victoria had read that agreement 40 times. She understood what it actually was. It was a transfer of operational control, structured through a labyrinth of holding companies and nominee directors, that would effectively hand Hale Financial to people who had no interest in investment banking and every interest in the kind of financial infrastructure that allowed large sums of money to move across borders without leaving clear records. She had tried to explain this to her legal team. Her lead attorney, a man named Gerald Fowler, who had represented her father for 2 decades, had stopped returning her calls on the 1st of October. By the 5th, his office had sent a brief letter informing her that the firm was withdrawing from representation due to a conflict of interest. No further explanation. Gerald Fowler had been a family friend. She had attended his daughter's wedding. Her executive assistant, a woman named Priya who had been with the company for 7 years, and whom Victoria trusted more than she trusted most of the board, had resigned on the 12th with 2 weeks' notice and an expression of genuine apology that told Victoria everything she needed to know. Priya had been approached. Priya had been afraid. Victoria did not blame her. She understood fear now in a way she had not understood it before, not as weakness but as information, as the body's honest accounting of what the mind was still trying to negotiate. Her own body had been delivering that message for weeks. She had simply not known what to do with it. She had hired a private technology consultant to sweep her devices on the 9th. He had found 3 separate monitoring applications installed on her work phone, one of them routing her call logs to an external server in real time. She had replaced the phone that afternoon and said nothing to anyone. The knowledge that she was being watched had settled into her chest like a stone, and she had carried it there in silence, because there was no one left to tell. Her father was gone. Her attorney was gone. Her assistant was gone. The board members she had trusted were either complicit or frightened into compliance. She had considered going to federal authorities, but without documentation, without something concrete, something that could not be dismissed or suppressed before it reached the right hands, she knew it would be her word against a very well-organized silence. She needed evidence. She did not know how to get it. She did not know who in the building she could trust. On the morning of October the 14th, as she stood at her window and watched the city and felt the particular solitude of someone surrounded by people who meant her harm, Victoria Hale understood that she was completely alone. The understanding did not arrive with drama. It arrived the way most unbearable things eventually arrive, quietly, precisely, and with the particular finality of something that cannot be untrue once you have recognized it. She had no next step. She had only the meeting, and the agreement, and the pen that would be placed before her, and the hours between now and that moment in which to find a way through something she could not yet see. Daniel Carter woke at 5:15 every morning without an alarm, because Emma woke at 5:30, and he liked to have the coffee started and the kitchen warm before she came padding down the hallway in her socks. This was a small thing. A domestic ritual that cost him nothing and meant everything. And it was one of the anchors around which he had reconstructed his life after the years that had threatened to pull him under completely. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that were calloused from work he had not been trained for, and eyes that were quiet, in the way of someone who has learned to observe without appearing to. He was not the kind of man who made strong first impressions. He was the kind of man who, once you understood what he actually was, you did not forget. Emma was 9, and she had her mother's dark eyes, and her mother's habit of tilting her head slightly when she was thinking something through. And sometimes when she did that tilt, Daniel had to look away for a moment to collect himself. Claire had died 3 years ago, after 18 months of illness, that had reorganized their entire existence around hospitals and treatment schedules, and the particular grief of watching someone you love fight as hard as a person can fight, and still lose. Emma had been 6. She remembered her mother. But the memories were softening at the edges in the way children's memories do, and Daniel sometimes feared the day she would ask him to describe something he wasn't sure he could find words for. He kept photographs. He told stories. He tried to make sure Claire remained present in their apartment even in her absence. A warmth in the walls, a continuity of love that he hoped Emma could feel even when she could not articulate it. Before Claire's illness, Daniel had spent 12 years as a senior security systems technician for a firm that contracted with financial institutions and government facilities. He had been good at the work, genuinely good. The kind of professional whose instincts about systems and vulnerabilities came from something more than training, something closer to pattern recognition that he had never been quite able to explain. He had managed teams, consulted on large-scale implementations, earned certifications that had taken years of study. When Claire was diagnosed, he had taken a leave of absence. When the leave extended, he had quietly resigned. When she died, he had not gone back. Because the person who had held that career together had been Claire, not because she had done anything to sustain it, but because she had been the reason it mattered, and without her, the ambition that had driven it felt like a language he no longer spoke. He had taken whatever work he could find that allowed him to be present for Emma. Flexible hours, physical labor, no expectation of advancement. He had worked at a hardware store for 8 months, then as a delivery driver, then through a janitorial services company that contracted with commercial buildings downtown. The pay was modest. The work was invisible, in the way that most essential work is invisible, the kind that everyone relies on, and no one notices. He did not mind the invisibility. There were, in fact, aspects of it he had come to appreciate. On the morning of October the 14th, he made Emma scrambled eggs and whole wheat toast, and listened to her tell him at considerable length about a disagreement she had at school the day before, involving a book report, and the question of whether dragons could technically be considered reptiles. He offered his opinion that they probably could, biologically speaking, if they were real, which made her argue the point with even greater enthusiasm. He drove her to school at 7:45 and watched her run through the front door without looking back, which meant she was happy, which meant the day had already succeeded in its most important purpose. His supervisor had assigned him that day to the executive floor of Hale Financial's headquarters, where a major board meeting was scheduled and the standard service crew needed supplementing. It was not an assignment he would have requested. He had worked in enough corporate environments to find their particular brand of hierarchy tedious. But it was work. And it was Tuesday. And Emma had a ballet class at 6 that he was not going to miss. He did not know, when he loaded his cart into the service elevator and pressed the button for the 32nd floor, that the next several hours were going to require everything he had ever learned, and several things he had not known he was still capable of. The board meeting was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock, and by 9:15 the executive conference room on the 32nd floor was already arranged with the particular deliberateness of a stage set. Water carafes on the table, leather folders at each place, the kind of atmosphere that signals importance through its own careful orderliness. Daniel moved through it with his cart, replacing the carafes, wiping surfaces that were already clean, performing the gestures of function that rendered him, to the people in the room, effectively absent. He had noticed this phenomenon many times over the past 2 years, the way that a uniform and a cart and a task created a kind of social invisibility, the way people in conference rooms talked around cleaning staff, the way they talked around furniture. He did not take it personally. He simply watched. There were 11 people in the room when he entered, some seated, some standing in clusters near the windows. He recognized the typeboard directors, lawyers, the particular posture of institutional power. One man stood near the head of the table, silver-haired and deliberate in his movements, overseeing the arrangement of documents with the quiet authority of someone who believes the room belongs to him. Daniel noted him without appearing to. Victoria Hale was standing apart from the others near the far windows, and she was looking at her phone with an expression that suggested she was not reading anything on it. She was a composed woman that was immediately apparent, but the composure had the quality of something being maintained at significant effort, the way a structure remains upright long after the conditions supporting it have changed. Daniel replaced the water carafe nearest to her. She did not look up. He began to move away. He was almost to the door when something made him pause, not a sound, not a word, but a shift in the room's atmosphere that he registered before he could name it. He turned back, barely, just enough to glance toward the windows. Victoria Hale was looking directly at him. Not through him, the way the others did, but at him with a directness that was completely at odds with everything else her body was communicating. Her expression did not change. Her posture did not change. But in the 2 or 3 seconds that their eyes met, something passed between them that was unmistakably deliberate. She looked away. He continued toward the door. He was in the hallway, cart beside him, preparing to move to the next room, when he noticed the folded paper on the floor near the base of his cart. It had not been there before. He picked it up with the unhurried motion of a man tidying up, and did not open it until he was inside the supply closet at the end of the hall, with the door shut behind him. The paper was a single sheet from a legal pad, folded twice. Inside, in handwriting that pressed hard into the page, with the urgency of someone writing in a small window of time, were 2 words, in capital letters. "Help me." He stood in the closet for a long moment, looking at those words. He was not a man who made decisions quickly or carelessly. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not at him as a janitor, not at him as a convenient person to hand something to, but at him as a person she had chosen, a person she had seen. He thought about the silver-haired man and the way he stood at the head of the table. He thought about Emma, at school right now, probably winning her argument about dragons. He folded the paper and put it in his front pocket and stood there in the dark of the supply closet for another minute, thinking very clearly, and then he went back to work. He did not go back to the 32nd floor that morning. He went, instead, to the building management office in the basement, where he had spent enough time over the previous 3 months to know the layout of the system infrastructure and the scheduling patterns of the security staff. The cleaning contractor's badge he wore gave him access to the service corridors and utility rooms on every floor, including the network infrastructure room on the 14th floor where the building's internal camera system fed to its central server. He had been in that room twice before, for legitimate reasons. And he had paid attention both times in the way that he paid attention to most things quietly, completely, without making it obvious. He was in the network infrastructure room by 11:15, and within 20 minutes he had accessed the camera archive for the 32nd floor dating back 60 days. What he found over the next 2 hours, watching footage on a screen in a room that hummed with server activity, was enough to make his chest feel cold. The silver-haired man, Richard Kane, as the board records, Daniel cross-referenced identified him, had been meeting in the executive conference room with a rotating group of individuals after building hours, between 10 at night and 2 in the morning, on at least 14 separate occasions. Some of these individuals appeared in no corporate directory Daniel could access. The meetings were not logged in any calendar system. On 3 occasions, men whom Daniel recognized from basic pattern analysis as private security personnel had swept the conference room before and after these gatherings. He found the financial records less quickly, because they required navigating through a secondary system linked to the building's legal tenant network, but his old professional knowledge of how corporate security systems were typically architected gave him a path. What he found were records of transactions routed through Hale Financial's internal accounting system to accounts at institutions in 3 separate jurisdictions. Each transfer structured just below the reporting threshold, each routed through an intermediary that appeared to be a legitimate consulting firm, but whose registered address, on investigation, was a mail forwarding service. The amounts were large. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who knew what money laundering actually looked like in practice rather than theory. Daniel had, as part of his earlier career, received training in financial crime indicators as they related to physical security risk assessments. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He downloaded what he could onto a personal drive he had brought with him, not because he had planned this specifically, but because he had learned, in 12 years of security work, to carry a drive the way other people carry a pen. He left the infrastructure room at 1:40 in the afternoon and returned his cart to the service bay and clocked out for his lunch break and sat in his car in the parking structure and tried to decide what to do next. The drive sat in his jacket pocket. The 2 words on the folded paper were already memorized. He had almost convinced himself that the right thing to do was to turn the drive over to federal authorities directly and leave the rest of it to people who were paid to handle this kind of problem, when he looked up and saw a gray sedan parked 2 rows ahead of him that had not been there when he arrived. The man in the driver's seat was looking at his phone, but the angle was wrong, the phone was too low, and the man was looking over it rather than at it. Daniel knew surveillance when he saw it. He had run surveillance. He sat very still and breathed slowly and looked at the sedan without appearing to. Then he started his car and drove back toward the building entrance and told himself that leaving was not the same as quitting. He was nearly to the exit when his phone rang. It was Emma's school, a woman from the front office, apologetic in tone, calling to let him know that a man had been on the sidewalk outside the school's main entrance that afternoon, not on school property, not doing anything technically wrong, but there nonetheless, and one of the teachers had noticed him paying particular attention to the children coming out for afternoon recess. The school had called the police as a precaution. The man had left before they arrived. The office was just informing parents, as a courtesy. Daniel sat in the parking structure exit lane with the engine running and the phone pressed to his ear and felt the specific cold clarity that arrives when something abstract becomes concrete. He thanked the woman. He told her he would be there to pick Emma up himself that afternoon. He hung up and sat for another moment. And the choice that had seemed complicated 3 minutes ago became very simple. Someone had sent a message. The message was, "We know who matters to you." His response to that message was not going to be retreat. He spent 20 minutes in the parking structure deciding exactly what his response was going to be instead. He thought about the drive in his pocket. He thought about Emma's school calling, and the man on the sidewalk, and the particular cold arithmetic of a threat designed to communicate that the people making it understood what you could not afford to lose. He thought about Victoria's 2 words on a piece of paper, the smallness of the gesture and the courage it had required, the way she had looked at him in a room full of people who treated her as furniture while treating him as air, and had chosen him anyway as the one person she would risk asking. You do not meet very many people who choose correctly under that kind of pressure. When you do, you remember it. He decided he was not going to let fear make his choices for him. He had done that once before, in the years after Claire died, and it had taken him a long time to rebuild the version of himself that he respected. He was not going to do it again. The parking garage on the building's east side was less monitored than the main structure, and it was there, 2 evenings later, that Victoria Hale found Daniel Carter waiting beside his car with the kind of stillness that made her realize, in the moment she saw him, that she had made the right choice on that Tuesday morning. She had spent 48 hours trying to create this opportunity, deflecting Richard's scheduling pressure, manufacturing a reason to access the east garage, moving without her corporate car service, so there were no records of her destination. She was wearing a coat that was not her usual coat, and she felt, walking across the concrete floor of the garage, like someone in a dream she had not chosen. They stood facing each other for a moment without speaking. He was taller than she had registered in the conference room. His eyes, she noticed now, had the quality of someone who was entirely present, not performing attention, actually attending. "You found the note," she said. "I found what was on the other side of the note," he said. She exhaled slowly. "Then you know." "Enough," he said. "Not all of it. Tell me the rest," she told him. She told him about her father, who had built Hale Financial over 30 years from a regional advisory firm into one of the most significant independent financial institutions in the country. She told him about the 8 months since the funeral, and the gradual realization that the mourning period had been used strategically, that while the company grieved its founder, Richard Kane had been assembling a coalition, converting board members through a combination of financial incentive and implied threat, engineering the conditions for a transfer that would have horrified Thomas Hale, and that Thomas Hale was no longer alive to prevent. She told him about the consortium and the offshore accounts and the attorney who had disappeared from her life. She told him about the agreement she was being pressured to sign, and what she believed it actually meant, and why she had not yet gone to the authorities, and why she could not simply walk away. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he told her things she had not known. He told her about the footage, the late-night meetings, the individuals who did not appear in any corporate record. He told her about the transaction pattern, the structure of the transfers, the jurisdictions involved, the shell company registered to a mail address. He described it with the precision of someone who understood financial crime not as an abstraction but as a system, a series of deliberate architectural choices designed to create distance between action and accountability. Victoria, who had spent her career in finance, felt the information settle into place around the edges of what she already knew, completing a picture she had been unable to fully see. "You were a security professional," she said. "I was," he said. "And you gave that up." "I gave a lot of things up," he said, without elaboration. And something in his tone told her not to press it, and she didn't. She asked him about the man outside Emma's school. He told her about it evenly, without the affect of someone seeking sympathy. And she felt the weight of it, the specific cruelty of threatening a child to contain a parent. She felt something shift in her chest that was partly guilt and partly something harder than guilt, something more like resolve. "They used your daughter," she said. "They tried to," he said. "And you're still here." "I'm still here," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, in the dim light of the parking garage, and she understood something she had not expected to understand. Standing in a concrete structure at 8 in the evening with a man she had met 3 days ago through 2 words on a scrap of paper. She understood that she had been surrounded for months by people with credentials and titles and years of institutional relationship, and that not one of them had chosen her when it cost them something. This man, who had no reason to, who had everything to lose, who had a 9-year-old girl at home who needed her father, had chosen to stay. It did not feel like a small thing. "We need one more piece," she said. "The board meeting is in 4 days. They're going to bring the final agreement. If I can stall long enough, and if you can get into the server room and pull the original contract files, the real ones, not the versions they've been showing the board, we might have enough." He nodded slowly. "I know which room," he said. "I know the schedule." "It's dangerous," she said. "I know," he said. "Tell me what you need." The server room was on the 28th floor. and the window was 8 minutes the gap between the end of one security patrol and the beginning of the next, which Daniel had calculated from 3 days of careful observation of the building's security log patterns. He had also identified that the camera covering the 28th floor corridor had a 6-second reboot delay when its system was power cycled from the infrastructure room, during which its feed was not recorded. He had written out the sequence in a small notebook, gone over it until it was automatic, and then burned the notebook page. He had done this kind of planning before, in a different life, under different stakes. The familiarity of it was strange, like returning to a language he thought he had forgotten, and finding that the grammar was still in his hands. Victoria had spent the morning before the server room attempt in a 2-hour session with Richard and 3 other board members, reviewing the agreement section by section, raising questions she already knew the answers to, requesting clarifications she did not need, performing the role of a CEO conducting due diligence, with enough conviction to consume the morning without signing anything. It required a specific kind of acting, not dishonesty exactly, but the controlled presentation of a version of herself that matched their expectations, the cautious executive weighing her options. She had been playing versions of this role for 3 months. She was very tired of it. Daniel entered the 28th floor at 12 minutes past 2 in the afternoon during the break between patrols. He moved quickly, because he thought best when he moved quickly. He had always been that way, better in action than in stillness. The first obstacle was the corridor camera, which he handled from a secondary access panel in the stairwell. The second was the server room's keypad lock, whose override code he had obtained through a method he preferred not to detail even to himself, derived from the building management system's maintenance logs. The third obstacle was a security guard who deviated from his scheduled route by approximately 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes Daniel had not budgeted for, and which required him to stand motionless inside a server rack alcove for what felt significantly longer than 4 minutes, while the guard walked past and then walked back, and then apparently satisfied himself that the room was empty, left. What he found on the server was more than he had hoped for. The files were not encrypted in any sophisticated way. They had been protected by access restriction rather than by encryption, which was the institutional equivalent of hiding something in a locked filing cabinet when someone with the right background can pick most locks. He found the original partnership agreements, predating the consortium's formation by nearly 2 years, which established that the arrangement had been in planning long before Thomas Hale's death and suggested premeditation at a scale that would be devastating to Richard Kane's legal position. He found correspondence between Richard and 2 board members that was explicit about the pressure tactics being applied to Victoria, including a reference to her attorney that left no ambiguity about the nature of Gerald Fowler's sudden withdrawal. He found audio files, recordings of the late-night meetings, clear enough to be admissible, featuring voices he recognized from the camera footage and statements that removed any question of intent. He copied everything onto the drive, closed the terminal, and was back in the stairwell, with 2 minutes remaining in the patrol window. He was on the service elevator heading back to the basement when the elevator stopped on the 20th floor, and 2 men in building security uniforms got in. Not regular security. He knew the regular security staff by now, knew their faces and their schedules, and these men were neither. They were too alert, too still, watching him with the professional evaluation of people who had been looking for someone and had decided they might have found him. He kept his expression neutral and his body language loose, and held his cart casually, and did not reach for his phone, and did not look at them directly, and thought very clearly about the drive in his jacket pocket and the 18 seconds remaining before the elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened on the lobby level, and he walked out at the unhurried pace of a man with a task to complete, and he did not turn around, and they did not follow him, and he kept walking until he reached the exterior loading bay, and pushed through the service door into the afternoon air, and stood for a moment in the unremarkable October sunshine, breathing. He sent Victoria a single text to the secondary phone they had agreed to use. "Got it." She replied in 3 seconds. Board meeting starts in 40 minutes. The original scheduled time had moved up. He had 40 minutes. He went back inside. The board meeting had the atmosphere of a ceremony whose outcome had already been decided. 12 people around the table, several lawyers along the wall, and through the conference room's glass exterior walls, The dim shapes of camera crews and journalists assembled in the corridor. News of the historic restructuring had been leaked to the financial press, and the meeting was expected to produce an announcement. Richard Kane stood at the head of the table with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes himself to be finishing something, and he placed the agreement in front of Victoria with a deliberateness that was almost theatrical, and he uncapped a pen and set it beside the document. And he said, with the warmth of a man performing graciousness, "Whenever you're ready, Victoria." She looked at the pen. She had been looking at the pen for 30 years of her career. Not this pen specifically, but the metaphorical object of it. The moment of signature, of commitment, of putting your name on something and accepting its consequences. She had signed agreements that created employment for thousands of people. She had signed agreements that funded research and built infrastructure and contributed to the kind of economic fabric that held communities together. She had always believed that what she signed mattered, that her name on a document was not a formality, but a declaration. This document would be the first thing she had ever signed that she was deeply, thoroughly ashamed of. She looked at it and thought of her father, who had been 68 years old when he died and had still believed, irrationally and completely, in the idea that business could be conducted with integrity. She thought of what he would have said to her now, in this room, with this pen. She thought of a man in a service elevator, somewhere in this building, carrying a drive. She picked up the pen. She did not sign anything. The conference room's main display screen, a panel that occupied most of the interior wall and was used for presentations and video calls, came on without warning, and the room's electronic door locks disengaged simultaneously, with a sound that everyone heard and no one immediately understood. The journalists in the corridor looked up from their phones. The board members looked at the screen. Richard Kane, whose expression had been one of settled certainty 30 seconds earlier, turned toward the display with something moving behind his eyes that was not yet fear, but was its immediate precursor. Daniel Carter walked through the conference room door in his work uniform, pushing nothing, carrying only the drive, which he connected to the conference room's input panel with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done the technical rehearsal and knows exactly what happens when. The screen showed the late-night meeting footage, first 12 people around a conference table after midnight, speaking with the candor of people who believe they are not being recorded. The audio was clear. The faces were clear. The content of the discussion was explicit about the nature of the arrangement and the methods being employed to secure Victoria's compliance, including the removal of her legal representation and the surveillance of her communications. There was a silence in the room of a particular quality, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who understand that saying anything will make it worse. Then the financial documents, annotated in a way that made the transaction structure legible even to people without specialized knowledge, the transfers, the intermediary companies, the jurisdictions, the amounts, the dates relative to Thomas Hale's death, and the formation of the consortium. Then the original partnership agreements, predating the board's knowledge of any arrangement by nearly 2 years, with Richard Kane's signature on documents that demonstrated the plan had been in development while Thomas Hale was still alive and had simply been waiting for him to stop being. Then the audio recordings from the server files, voices making statements that no attorney was going to be able to contextualize into innocence. Richard Kane moved toward the door. He moved with the decision of a man who has identified his only option and is committed to it, and he was within 3 feet of the corridor when the corridor filled with people in federal law enforcement identification who had been waiting there since Daniel, from the service elevator, had sent a second message to a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, a woman he had worked with, years ago, in a professional capacity, and who had responded to his documentation 6 hours earlier with a terseness that meant she was already moving. The board members did not move. The lawyers became very interested in their own hands. The journalists in the corridor, who had come expecting to document a corporate transaction, documented instead something considerably more significant and considerably less scripted. Victoria set the pen down on the table. She set it down carefully, parallel to the agreement she was not going to sign, and she looked at it for a moment. And then she looked at Daniel Carter, who was standing near the display panel with the expression of a man who has finished something and is not sure yet what to do with his hands. She held his gaze for a moment across the width of the conference room, with 12 board members and several lawyers, and the beginning of a federal arrest between them. And she nodded once. He nodded back. It took 3 weeks for the full scope of the investigation to be established, and for the initial arrests to be processed. Richard Kane was taken into custody on the day of the board meeting. 2 board members followed within 72 hours. The consortium's principals, operating from 2 different countries, were the subject of extradition requests that the legal team, a new legal team, assembled by Victoria in the days following the meeting, characterized as likely to succeed given the documentation available. The offshore accounts were frozen. The shell companies were unwound. Gerald Fowler, Victoria's former attorney, cooperated with investigators in exchange for considerations that were not made public, and his cooperation produced additional documentation that strengthened the case further. Hale Financial survived. It survived not only the legal exposure of the attempted takeover, but the reputational scrutiny that accompanied it, in large part because the story that emerged from the investigation, a story about a young CEO who had been systematically isolated and pressured, and who had persisted anyway, was a story that the public and the market both understood as a narrative of institutional integrity, rather than institutional failure. The company's share price declined sharply in the week following the board meeting, and then recovered, and then, over the following quarter, climbed to a level it had not reached in 3 years. Victoria spent those weeks working 18-hour days, rebuilding relationships with clients and partners and regulatory contacts, remaking the board with people she had vetted herself, establishing internal controls that were more transparent and more robust than anything the company had operated under before. She was exhausted in a way that felt different from the exhaustion of the previous month's clean, rather than suffocating. The exhaustion of work rather than the exhaustion of fear. She thought about Daniel Carter frequently during those weeks. She thought about the parking garage and the way he had listened. She thought about what it had cost him to stay, and what he had risked, and what he had never asked for in return. She had tried, in the immediate aftermath of the board meeting, to express something of what she owed him, and he had deflected it in the way she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, not from false modesty, but from a genuine discomfort with the framing of debt, as though what he had done was too natural to be categorized as sacrifice. She did not quite agree with that framing, but she respected it. On a Saturday morning in early November, 3.5 weeks after the board meeting, Victoria drove herself no driver, no security detail, which still felt slightly transgressive to the address she had looked up in the company's janitorial contractor records. It was a residential building in a neighborhood that was neither wealthy nor shabby, the kind of neighborhood that was composed mostly of people who worked and managed, and asked nothing from the city except to be left alone to do it. She buzzed the apartment, and after a pause, Daniel's voice came through the intercom, and she said her name, and there was a silence. And then the door opened. He met her at the top of the stairs with an expression that suggested he had not entirely known what to expect, and had not quite prepared for this specific version of it. He was in the clothes of a Saturday morning jeans, a worn flannel shirt, and he looked different out of his work uniform, less abstracted by function, more simply himself. She noticed this, and found it easier, somehow, than she had anticipated. Emma was at the kitchen table when Victoria came in, working on something with colored pencils, with the focused intensity of a 9-year-old who has decided that what she is doing matters. She looked up at Victoria with the direct, evaluative gaze of a child who has not yet learned to disguise assessment as politeness, and apparently found the assessment satisfactory, because she said, "You have nice boots," and returned to her drawing. Victoria sat down at the kitchen table without being asked, because it was that kind of kitchen. And Daniel made coffee, and they talked for 2 hours about things that were not the board meeting or the investigation, or any of it about Emma's school, about the neighborhood, about what Daniel had been doing with himself in the week since the contractor arrangement had ended, and he had needed to consider what came next. He was, he said, still figuring that out. She told him about the restructuring of the company's security division, which had been operating for years on outdated protocols, and which she was rebuilding from the ground up with a new director. She described the scope of the role. She described what she was looking for, not just technical expertise, but judgment. The kind of institutional instinct that could not be credentialed. She was not casual about it. She was direct, because she was always direct, and because she thought he deserved directness, rather than a softer form of the offer that would have been easier for both of them. He listened the way he always listened, completely. And then he was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "That's a serious job," he said. "It is," she said. "It would change things," he said. By which she understood, he meant more than logistics. He meant the shape of his days, the careful equilibrium he had built, the particular piece of a life arranged around what mattered most. "It would," she said, "but you'd still be home by 6. Emma chose this precise moment to look up from her drawing and say, without any particular preamble, "Dad, is Victoria your girlfriend now?" The kitchen became very quiet, in the way that spaces become quiet when everyone in them is simultaneously deciding how to handle something. Daniel looked at his coffee with the expression of a man weighing his options. Victoria looked at Emma, who was looking back at her with perfect equanimity, waiting for an answer. Pencil still in hand. "No," Daniel said. "Okay," Emma said, apparently satisfied, and went back to her drawing. "She does that," Daniel said, to Victoria, without looking up. "I noticed," Victoria said. There was a moment, and then they both laughed, quietly. The kind of laughter that comes from shared recognition rather than shared joke, and the kitchen was warm, and the November light came through the window at an angle that was low and golden, and made the ordinary objects on the table look, briefly, like something that had been painted. Victoria stayed another 40 minutes. She said goodbye to Emma, who gave her the drawing she had been working on. It appeared to be a horse, or possibly a dragon, standing in front of what might have been a building. "For you," Emma said, with the generosity of someone giving something they have made. Victoria folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, and felt something compress in her chest in a way that was not unpleasant. At the door, Daniel told her he would think about the job. "Take your time," she said, "but not too much." He said he would call by the end of the week. She went down the stairs and back to her car, and drove through the Saturday morning city, under a sky that was the pale gold of early autumn, and she thought about what it meant to have come through something not unscathed, because that was not available, but through, with the other side visible and the light different than it had been before. She thought about her father, who had believed in integrity, and had been right to believe in it, even when it cost something. She thought about Emma's horse, or dragon, in her pocket. She thought about a man who had read 2 words on a piece of paper and understood them correctly, not just what they said, but what they asked, and what it meant to answer. Daniel called on Thursday. He said yes. He started the following Monday. And when he arrived on his first day in the elevator that went to the executive floor, not the service elevator this time, the main elevator, with a badge that had his name and photograph, and his new title, he stood in the lobby of the 32nd floor and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows for a moment, the way Victoria stood there in the mornings, and he thought about all the days that had led to this one, and he thought that Claire would have found the whole thing deeply satisfying, in the way she had found most things that confounded expectation deeply satisfying. On the evening of that first Monday, he picked Emma up from school at 5:45, and they walked home through the early November dark, and she told him about her day, and he listened, and the city went about its business around them, indifferent and beautiful. He was home in time for dinner. The apartment was warm, the day had been long and significant, and he was tired in the way that meant something had been accomplished, and it felt nothing at all like loss. 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening, the 3 of them walked out of the Hale Financial Building together, after a company event that Emma had attended as Victoria's guest. Victoria had called her the company's most distinguished visitor, and Emma had accepted the designation with appropriate gravity. They came out through the main entrance onto the sidewalk, and the sun was low and orange over the buildings to the west, and the air was cold in the specific way of early December, and Emma walked between them with her coat buttoned wrong and her drawing bag over one shoulder. narrating something about a project she was planning that would, apparently, require significant parental cooperation and possibly a library visit. Victoria walked beside them and let Emma talk, and watched the city in its evening light and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely locate, that the space around her was not a trap. She was not alone in it. She had not been saved in the way that stories sometimes describe saving dramatically, completely, with the threat permanently resolved, and the world returned to some prior state of safety. She had been accompanied through something dangerous by someone who had chosen to be there. And the danger was past, and the choosing had mattered. And they were walking in the same direction under the same sky, and the evening was cold and clear and unambiguously real. There are people who enter your life through the doors that power opens. They arrive with credentials and connections, and the particular warmth of those who have calculated that warmth serves them. And then there are those who enter through the gaps, through the small, overlooked spaces that the powerful walk past without seeing, and who choose you, not because of what you represent, but because of what you need, and because choosing you costs them something, and they choose you anyway. Victoria Hale had spent her career surrounded by the first kind. She had needed the second kind of person to remind her that such people existed. Sometimes the one who saves you is not the most powerful person in the room. Sometimes it is the only person in the room who was paying attention for the right reasons. The only one who read 2 words on a piece of paper and understood that they were not a request but a trust, and honored it. The sun set, the city lit up. The 3 of them kept walking,